Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So, how did Europe restore order after the social and political upheaval of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic regime? Well, European leaders got together and set up a committee, or a Congress, that met in Vienna to set things straight. Nice town, Vienna. Really good sausages. I went there once. There a lot of skeletons under the city, which freaked me out pretty bad. What were we talking about? Right, the Congress of Vienna. So, when Europe looked around at the previous century with its endless wars, the reign of reason seemed disastrous, and so Europe turned to its past and a conservatism that embraced monarchies and Romanticism. They believed that Enlightenment ideas like the support of individual rights had caused too much turmoil and misery, and so they wanted to go back to simpler times, when kings were kings, peasants were landless, and obedience mattered more than thinking. So even as Napoleon was on his way back from exile to the continent in 1815 to try to retake his empire, the Congress of Vienna had been meeting to restore stability. Its members included representatives from Russia, the Habsburg Empire, Prussia, Britain, and France, which, though defeated, was still central to discussions about how to return to the old order. The first step was to bring back the French royal family, starting with the executed king's brother, Louis XVIII, who was known as the Desired, because presumably that was the only way to get him to take the job that killed his brother. Like, you're desired. We want you. We're not going to guillotine you. The second step was to balance out the great power interests, which meant ensuring France was no longer a menace, and also that no state felt aggrieved enough to start another war. A major player at the Congress was, oddly enough, a once leading minister of Napoleon, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. God, that was great. In the bajillion years since I graduated from high school, my high school French teacher has died, and that is very sad, but at the same time, I am glad that she is not here to hear me speak French. So during Napoleon's reign, Talleyrand had been a relentless womanizer and also a relentless seeker of bribes. Like a lot of people who succeed in politics, he was mostly like a moth that flew toward the lights of power and influence. So with Napoleon's defeats, Talleyrand of course switched sides to support Louis XVIII and was just the kind of well-connected wheeler-dealer that the Congress of Vienna needed. The Congress's initial idea for a settlement with France involved basically leaving France and its restored monarch alone to enjoy a good number of their revolutionary conquests, but those moderate terms became harsh when Napoleon returned to France in the spring of 1815 to much acclaim from many of his French followers, including especially veterans of his army. Then after Napoleon and his forces were defeated at Waterloo in June of 1815, the Allies imposed an indemnity, meaning France would be responsible for some of the losses they had caused, and the Allies decided that they would occupy France until that indemnity was paid. The presiding spirit over the Congress and its negotiations was the Austrian minister Prince Clemens von Metternich. Through his arch-conservative eyes, there was a lot to worry about. One concern was the resurgence of revolution, a possibility he worked to prevent through the use of secret police, spies, and censorship. But for him, stopping revolution also entailed closing down student fraternities as breeding grounds for liberal ideas. Basically, attempts to restore individual rights or freedom or achieve any part of the liberal program of the revolutionaries were seen as criminal. Metternich was also concerned about Russia, which was now the strongest continental power, and he wanted to prevent its further expansionism. And he felt that a strong monarchy in France would help make France powerful enough to check the power of Russia, thereby bringing Europe into socio-political balance. Did the center of the world just open? Is there Jenga in there? So you're going to hear the phrase balance of powers a lot in the next 200 years. The idea is that if we can just distribute power among communities the way that we distribute the load of Jenga pieces, even if something goes wrong, the thing doesn't fall. It's worked great for 200 years. What's that? Oh gosh, Stan says that there's a World War I coming. The Congress also divvied up available territories and resources. Britain received some of France's territory in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, for instance, while Prussia was allocated part of Saxony and Austria was given Italian and other territory. There was also the leftover question of Poland, so remnants of the Duchy of Warsaw state fell to Russian control, with the remaining pieces going to Prussia and Austria. Basically, the Congress of Vienna settlement had something for everyone, except for the Poles. We're beginning the "this was good news for everyone except for the Poles" period of European history, which ends... When did it end, Stan? in 1991. So in addition to working toward the balance of powers, the Congress established a Congress system in Europe for arriving at agreements and enforcing them. And this would become very important. For one thing, it helped change the way we understand how people come into power. Like, the Congress did not imagine kingship as deriving from some divine power, but instead from the decision-making of the combined great powers. And the group acted with one voice, arriving at common policies, which was key to their strength. This system is often called the Concert of Europe, and in some ways it did presage the contemporary European Union. Besides establishing the conditions for peacetime, thinkers across Europe were also devising political theory for this post-revolutionary age. Leading politicians embraced Edmund Burke's theory of conservatism, for instance, which emphasized tradition and the wisdom enshrined in institutions from the past. Monarchy, according to conservatives, was the primary institution because it had endured for centuries, so it provided age-old political stability. The aristocracy also claimed an acquired superiority simply because of the long-lived leadership of its families. In other words, the middle classes, who promoted hard work and money-making skills, were no longer really models of capability. Instead, readers flocked to Sir Walter Scott's tales of knights from the past as testimonial to aristocratic bravery, especially when they were defeating the citizen-led armies of Napoleon. And the chivalrous Middle Ages were rebranded as a golden age, despite all that Black Death, famine, and schism in the church. It truly is astonishing what humans can, with time, nostalgicize. Religion emerged as another part of the old regime that needed to be restored. In tandem with the other terms of the political settlement, Russia, Prussia, and Austria agreed among themselves to a holy alliance. This alliance would support the diverse Christian religions of the three kingdoms and also emphasize the importance of good old-fashioned Christian obedience to the church. No matter which church it is, just please be obedient to it. At the same time, religious activism renewed focus on philanthropy. Like aristocratic Catholics in France, for example, called themselves socialists because they were concerned that the strong emphasis on individualism had resulted in the deterioration of community and society. Now, they were unrelated to the Marxist socialists who would later preach about revolution. These French socialists raised money to aid the poor in their towns and city centers. In Protestant countries, religion made a comeback as part of the Second Great Awakening. Like the first, it emphasized religious feeling instead of strict theological learning. In Britain, Methodist churches sprang up, shunning the fancy ceremonials and religious hierarchies of Anglicanism. Instead of bowing to archbishops and British aristocrats, they worshipped among their own kind in a spirit of democracy. Another result of conservatism was a new rationale for allegiance to a kingdom or state. Conservatives didn't promote constitutions and the rule of law like the French and US revolutionaries did with their Enlightenment-inspired governing structures. Instead, they saw nations as stemming from historical evolutions of noble families and a common language and common heritage. They collected folk tales and artifacts from the past, considered to be a central way to understand a kingdom's story, and the way things had always been done was the way they should be done in the present and in the future. These ideas brought about clashes within nations, of course, between the agrarian interests of the landed aristocracy and the budding wealth of urban industrialists and financiers. Industrialists often wanted progressive change, such as infrastructure that would support their businesses, while landed aristocrats wanted to ensure that traditional hierarchies would not be disturbed on account of how they benefited from them. Let's go to the thought bubble. There was another new idea dominating the post-revolutionary era, the culture of Romanticism, which replaced the culture of Enlightenment. Romanticism held that the world of feeling was far superior to the regime of reason, that nature was superior to manufacturing, and that the past was better than the present. Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and you'll recall that in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft emphasized the need for knowledge and reason in people's lives. But her daughter's novel, Frankenstein, took the opposite stance in some ways. It's a story in part about what can be wrought by reason run amok. For Shelley, the lack of feeling, not the lack of reason, lay at the heart of social problems, and unchecked reason, like that of Dr. Frankenstein, created monstrosities. Meanwhile, Russian poet Alexander Pushkin wrote the novel Eugene Onegin in the kind of romantic, flowery verse that stands in stark contrast to the cold and rational exposition of Enlightenment novelists like Voltaire. Eugene Onegin tells the story of a tragically ill-timed romance between Onegin and Tatiana as the two attempt to navigate paths between strong emotion and the traditions of Russian courtship. It's remembered today in part because it explores the paradoxes of Romantic thinking without dismissing any perspective. Indeed, Pushkin himself followed at least one of the conventions of traditional male honor in his own life. He died in a duel with his wife's purported lover. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So not only did Romantic poets write about nature, they also invoked foreign lands and exoticism, an exoticism that was earlier expressed in material goods like textiles and porcelain and umbrellas and coffee. Painters depicted nude women in harems, even though none had ever entered a harem, much less seen a nude woman in one. And Samuel Coleridge wrote in Kubla Khan of an opium dream in which he is mystically transported to another time and place. Percy Bysshe Shelley, husband of Mary Shelley, wrote of distant Asia. Still others, escaping harsh reality, composed odes to poppies, from which opium was derived. Sir Walter Scott, like other novelists, wrote about the Middle Ages, but he too reached romantic intensity, in part because of his opium addiction. The highs and lows of existence, the raging storms, the extreme suffering, the foreboding moods, all of this characterized the desire to turn Enlightenment rationality upside down with intense emotion, or even to personally escape from that hyper-reasoned reality. Musicians also conveyed romantic highs and lows. They did this by juxtaposing thunderous choruses with more tender passages. Composer Ludwig van Beethoven, the extremely intense fellow behind me, excelled at creating these types of musical contrasts. The crisp and disciplined compositions of the Enlightenment, meanwhile, were gone. Individualism, which had not really entered the 18th century Enlightenment world until Rousseau wrote of his individual emotions, also figured heavily in post-revolutionary thought. Romantic individualism emphasized poetic or other forms of genius. Like during the Enlightenment and Revolutionary years, individual rights and liberties for everyone dominated debates, but in the post-revolutionary era, both history and fiction began to look at and, in a way, worship the individual great man. These great individuals, who tended to be cleaned-up military stars, were seen to be the central drivers of historical change, and the individuals at the center of every great tale, whether it was fiction or not. And this still shapes our way of looking at history and other stories. While almost all inventions, for instance, are the result of broad and complex networks of collaborators, we still tend to put individuals at the center of those stories, whether it's Edison and his light bulb or Napoleon and his army. But try as they might, leaders at the Congress of Vienna and a cultural emphasis on conservatism could not quash the revolutionary spirit, especially the spirit embodied by the idea that people were citizens of a community rather than subjects of a king. And amid all these political changes, another revolution was shaking the economic status quo so dramatically that old ways of thinking about peasants and land and aristocrats would soon prove untenable. The nature of work and life were being profoundly reshaped by the Industrial Revolution. In France in 1780, somewhere around 60% of people worked in agriculture. 200 years later, in 1980, only 8% did. The Industrial Revolution will change how we spend our days, how we relate to one another and to the world, what we value, and in some ways, who we are. That's next time. I'll see you then. Crash Course is filmed here in the Jaden Smith Studios in Indianapolis. Thanks to all of our patrons at patreon.com/crashcourse who make it possible for us to make these videos free for everyone forever. We have lots of other Crash Courses you can watch. World Mythology, we got that. Sociology, yeah! Thanks again for watching, and as they say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.